We dive into the latest Baltimore Ravens updates ahead of 2024 free agency, including if Michael Thomas could be on the way to Baltimore, if Odell Beckham Jr. is on his way out, and a lot more. Plenty to talk about here on today's episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here, making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every single day. Are free and available on all podcasts and platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube if you want to like the video, subscribe to the channel. That helps out a ton. Also in audio form wherever you get your podcasts, however you want to listen, whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or again, wherever you get your shows. Be sure to follow along. Also, subscribe over there as well. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We are 5 days a week here on Locked On Ravens. Not one, not two, not three, not four, all 5 days of the week on Locked On Ravens, plus bonus content. We will be going live later today, actually, talking about the Ravens' decision, whatever it is, with Justin Madubuike and the franchise tag. At the time of this recording, I don't know what's going to end up happening with that, whether he actually is franchise tagged or if an extension is reached. I'm not even going to entertain the third scenario of him not having the franchise tag on him and hitting on trigger free agency. We're not going to talk about that. So we're going to be going live later in the day to talk about the end result, the franchise tag deadline being today at 4 p.m. Eastern. But we're going to be talking about some wide receiver talk in the first couple of segments here today. We're going to be talking about a rumor that circulated over the weekend, and then also another one. Both rumors actually came out on Sunday, and we're going to be talking about them today. First, Michael Thomas of the Saints, free agent wide receiver. There were some rumblings that scouts view him as a good fit for the Ravens. We'll talk about if he is on his way to Baltimore and then what that could mean if the Ravens do decide to go that route. And in the second part of the show, we'll talk about Odell Beckham Jr. because in that same rumor, apparently Odell Beckham Jr. is not likely to re-sign with the Ravens, and the Ravens are likely going to let him go. So we'll talk about that as well, and whether there's any chance at all Odell does come back to the Ravens. And of course, we'll talk about Madubuike and franchise tag talk, just previewing the whole situation for, of course, today's live stream later in the day. So let's talk about Michael Thomas here first. Very interesting. A guy who, again, has been one of the better receivers in the league, or at least has been at that point. Now, of course, he has not been there over the last couple of seasons. Injuries really playing a part there. Just some general background on Michael Thomas. Came out of Ohio State in 2016 and spent his entire career in New Orleans. And he burst onto the scene even as a rookie. His rookie season had 92 catches for 1,137 yards and 9 touchdowns in 15 games. Now, the big thing with Thomas, though, has been the injuries. He was relatively healthy. In fact, he was very healthy. Only missed one game in his first 4 seasons, and that's where he really did his damage and established himself as one of the best receivers in this league. And so for me, Thomas is a guy that he has name value, and look, he won the Offensive Player of the Year in 2019. He was that good, where he had 149 catches for 1,725 yards and 9 touchdowns that season. He had 4 straight years coming out of college, going into the league as a 1,000-plus yard receiver. But then the injuries have taken their toll on him. 7 games in 2020, 0 games in 2021, 3 games in 2022, and 10 games in 2023. That's a lot of games missed. And I pulled up his injury log. I did this with Julio Jones, actually, who we're going to actually talk about in this segment here. But he had an injury in college and had sports hernia surgery before entering the league. In 2016, he missed that one game I talked about. Then again, was healthy from really his rookie season up until 2020. Then he suffered a high ankle sprain grade 3, suffered a hamstring sprain, another ankle sprain. And in fact, that ankle sprain caused him to miss the entirety of the 2021 season that I talked about. Another hamstring pull there, a toe dislocation which he didn't come back from, and then an MCL sprain last year, which he didn't come back. So all these different injuries, they add up over time. And for Thomas, you see how good of a player he is when he's at his peak, but can you rely on him to be that guy? Thomas is the type of player the Ravens, I think, would love to have. He's 6'3", 212 pounds. He's known for his ability to run slants, has a couple nicknames in that regard. I mentioned the 2019 Offensive Player of the Year. He's a 3-time Pro Bowler, 2-time All-Pro as well. He's an accomplished wide receiver, but where is he at this point in his career? What can he provide you at this point in his career? I'm not necessarily giddy on the potential of them getting Michael Thomas, the Ravens. Now, I wouldn't hate it. Like, I don't think it's a terrible, terrible move. But I think for what the Ravens have with Odell, or at least what they had, him going into free agency, the question is, how much of a difference is Michael Thomas compared to Odell Beckham Jr.? Is there enough of, I guess, a needle-moving move there? Is that a needle-moving move for the Ravens going from Odell Beckham to Michael Thomas? Because I anticipate the Ravens signing one veteran receiver or bringing in one veteran receiver. If that's Michael Thomas, I mean, how happy would you be? How happy would the organization be with what they get? I don't know. And this is where I'm going to talk about Julio Jones, because if you remember, if you're an everydayer, you remember on Locked On Ravens. If you're a Ravens fan, you know that the Ravens were linked to Julio Jones for years and years and years and years. And what that whole conversation was, it's kind of similar to Michael Thomas, where you have to account for missed games in that situation because the injuries have just been too much. Now, again, he was healthy early in his career, but that's not the Michael Thomas we're talking about anymore. I wish it was, and I wish the Ravens were in a place where if they signed Michael Thomas, they wouldn't have to worry about this. But Draft Sharks does a really good job, actually, of calculating out percentages of how much even like the guy will get injured during a game. What's the percentage there? Chance of injury in 2023. There's a 64% chance that Michael Thomas misses at least 2 quarters in 2023. He's projected to miss right about 3.5 games. And he's actually has a 5.8% chance to get injured per game. So you have to be able to figure it out. Actually, Draft Sharks here has him at a durability score of 1.79 out of 5. So that's not great. So the conversation with Julio was, can you bring him in and expect to have him for a full season? The answer was no, and it's the same thing for Michael Thomas. It's even, we were talking about it with Sammy Watkins too, and Sammy Watkins came into Baltimore. Watkins had many injuries before he came in, and the whole conversation was, you're signing Sammy Watkins, but you have to have backup plans. Injuries happen in football, right? Anybody can get injured. I'm not trying to play that game where, nobody can get injured in football, and if this guy gets injured, that. No, anybody can get injured. But when the consistent medical history is there, you have to have backup plans. And is that worth it? Now, I think that the injury history to Thomas will bring his value down. Like, I think the Ravens could get a potential pure number 1 receiver if he's healthy at a relatively cheap price. But then the conversation points is, 1, is he healthy? And 2, with him being 31, has he lost some of that burst? Has he lost some of that speed? The injuries, have they taken a toll on his body? So when you talk about then a guy like Odell Beckham Jr., we kind of talked about the same thing too, where injuries, he's not prime New York Giants Odell. When the Ravens got him in, we had that conversation. It's the same conversation with Michael Thomas in terms of he is not prime New Orleans Saints Michael Thomas. It'd be awesome if he was, but that's just not the reality that we're talking about right now. And what if Michael Thomas gets injured? What if? Because these past couple of years with the injuries, he's had to go down. He went down mid-season and didn't come back. So if he goes down in week 8 for the Ravens and he misses the rest of the season, then you're down pretty much the veteran receiver you invested in. You have to go back to the drawing board. And what we've seen the Ravens do is, again, they'll bring in these veterans that aren't very good anymore, or they're washed up. And it's not the formula. For me, I would want the Ravens to add a potential longer-term piece where they're not going back to the well continuously every year, because what's to say Michael Thomas doesn't take the Odell route, which I'm assuming is going to be signs a 1-year deal with the Ravens and then leaves the next offseason. What if it's again, they're continuously going to the well? We've had this conversation for years of them bringing in these veteran receivers for a year. It works out. Some cases, well, Steve Smith was here for more than a year. He's in Baltimore for more than a season. But again, you talk about guys like Michael Crabtree and Jeremy Maclin, who might have been, that era was so bad. I don't remember if he was there for 1 or 2, but it's those type of guys. Mike Wallace was an impact player for them, but he wasn't like this star. But Odell was like the pinnacle, like top star type player that they brought in. He's a celebrity. He's an international celebrity. Now, Michael Thomas, and for Odell on the field, obviously, him being the player that he was, his star power was still there despite him not being prime Odell. So he was better than a Jeremy Maclin or Michael Crabtree. But if I'm the Ravens, I don't want to go back to that well continuously. And this with Michael Thomas, it's not a long-term fix. I'm not saying, draft all these players and go super young like they did in 2022. That's not the answer. But, go get a guy who's 27 or 25 or 26, 28 even if you want to. I think to me, that's a better option for them. But again, there are only so many of those guys available. I will say the one guy I'd be very intrigued with, just I'm laying this out here for now, maybe a little hot take. Cortland Sutton is a guy I'd be very interested to see if the Ravens have any interest in this offseason. I would take that 10 times out of 10 over Michael Thomas. So I wouldn't hate the move, but I can just kind of see it, I can see how it unfolds, right? It feels like they bring him in, makes a couple plays for him, but you deal with the injuries, and depending on when that injury happens, it could be catastrophic to the Ravens. Coming up in the second part of the show, we will talk about Odell Beckham Jr. a little bit more and the rumor that he is potentially on the way out of Baltimore. Stay tuned, plenty to talk about on Locked On Ravens. First, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you go for a run? Would you take a nap, read a book, show up for a friend? A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you do more of it. And therapy has so many different benefits. For example, learning positive coping skills. It can teach you how to set boundaries. It empowers you to become that version of yourself. It isn't for those who experience major trauma. It's for everyone. Everything is starting therapy. Get BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a very questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. We're back to our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Ostreicher still talking with you here on this Taco Tuesday. Again, thanks so much for being here and making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day. Be sure to subscribe in video form on YouTube, audio form wherever you get your shows as well. Really appreciate it. Also, be sure to follow me on social media, ChaosStriker34, both on Twitter and Instagram. Really trying to build up the Instagram, so really appreciate any followers over there. Also on Twitter, same thing. Would appreciate a follow over there as well. We talked about Michael Thomas a little bit, whether he is potentially going to come to the Ravens, but let's talk about the other rumor. These both come out from ESPN, and it's interesting because there are all these kind of rumblings and rumors that happen throughout the course of the days and weeks leading up to the free agency. The Ravens have been mentioned a couple of times, but these rumors seem pretty substantial, especially this one about Odell Beckham Jr., where Jeremy Fowler reported that the Ravens are unlikely to re-sign Odell, potentially going in and making a move for another veteran receiver such as a Michael Thomas. Now, I've laid this out before on Locked On Ravens. I think I literally did it yesterday, but I'm going to do it again here today just for anybody who is new listening to the show. If you're an everydayer, you've heard me say this time and time and time again, so thanks for tuning in. Also, if you're new, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you're enjoying the content and enjoying the show. If you're somewhere in the middle, thanks for joining as well. But I'm a big proponent of the team having 6 wide receivers. I just think that's the sweet spot number. The Ravens have 4 right now. It's Zay Flowers, it's Rashad Bateman, it's Tylan Wallace, and it's also Nelson Aguilar, who they brought back. Now, that leaves 2 spots. I'd anticipate one goes to a veteran and one goes to a rookie, someone who they draft. Now, I essentially think the Ravens chose Nelson Aguilar over Odell Beckham Jr. I think that they were looking to see who that 4th spot would go to. Aguilar, someone who obviously made a lot of big plays for the Ravens last year, and I'm fine with them bringing him back. I thought it was a really good move for them too. But for Odell, I think Spotrac has Odell right around maybe 1 year $12 million, 1 year $11 million for a contract. I'm probably not paying Odell that money. Maybe with incentives, I'd pay him that. But in terms of base, I'm probably looking more towards like 1 year $7 million, 1 year $8 million. And there have also been other rumblings about Odell and his personal life and this, that, and the other. Again, I don't know how many of those rumors are true or not. All this coming from like Daily Mail and whatever. So again, you can take that source there and think what you think about it. But I don't really know what the whole situation with him and Kim Kardashian is. But it's been gaining a lot of traction, a lot of headlines, and there was some rumbling or rumor that he's looking to move more towards LA, more towards the West Coast to be closer to her. So again, I don't know how true that is. I'm just literally saying what I read, but I'm not saying there's any truth to it. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. But Odell was someone who I thought brought a lot of positive to the Ravens last year. His stats won't wow you. The Ravens signed him to an $18 million deal worth obviously up to 15 in guarantees, or I guess the deal was worth up to 18 million, but it was 15 guaranteed. I'll do it that way because that's the correct way. I misspoke there. Sorry about that. But Odell was, I guess fine from a stats perspective, but with the contract they paid him, it wasn't, didn't live up to the expectations, I guess. 35 catches for 565 yards and 3 touchdowns. Now, we know the veteran leadership was definitely there. Taught, I think, Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman, and even guys like Lamar, those younger players, a lot of good things. But as I kind of mentioned in the first segment, it's not prime Odell, not New York Giants Odell. So expectations, I was kind of trying to say, look, we got to manage expectations here. Odell also got injured pretty early in the season, had missed a couple of games and was coming off the ACL. He had suffered in the Super Bowl in 2021, missed obviously all of 22. So he was trying to come back from that, and John Harbaugh and Odell and the team were very vocal about how there's a plan for Odell. At least there was a plan for Odell to get him up to full strength. And Odell made plays for the Ravens. He made a couple of great, huge, big plays for them, a couple of really nice deep catches, some touchdowns that were key in big spots. So Odell did a lot for the Ravens, but again, he wasn't a 1,000-yard wide receiver. He wasn't a 10-touchdown guy, and that's not what they were necessarily asking of him. But when you talk about up to $18 million worth of production on the field, Odell didn't necessarily give them that in terms of the pure box score. Now, part of it has to do with the fact that the Ravens obviously run the ball a lot, so necessarily targets weren't there as opposed to other teams that maybe he could have gone to. But it's so weird to say this, but I can see Odell going to the Chiefs next year or going to the Bills, one of those teams that has pretty glaring wide receiver questions outside of one guy. I mean, not that Baltimore doesn't. Obviously, I think Zay, if everything works out, is your top dog, your number one wide receiver. But for Odell, it then becomes a question for him of, well, even though he loved Baltimore, it definitely seems like he did, and it seems like he had a lot of positive experiences with the team. What does he prioritize right now? And maybe the Ravens just don't want to give him all that money. Maybe he's asking for a certain number, and the Ravens are saying, we don't really want you back at that price, or maybe they're not going to be able to give him the role that he wants necessarily, with Zay probably being the number one moving forward, or Rashad Bateman hopefully getting involved a little bit more. So maybe it's just not going to work out for a couple of different reasons, but it does seem like Odell is on the way out, and it wouldn't shock me if he signs with a new team pretty quickly. Now, maybe he takes his time, right, mulls over his options and figures it out, but maybe there's already a destination Odell has in mind, and we'll kind of see what happens with it. But I think Baltimore, even without Odell, will be okay. I think there are definitely opportunities for them to upgrade. I do think Michael Thomas would be an upgrade, but it's not necessarily a needle-moving move for me. I would want, if the Ravens were to go out there and quote-unquote replace Odell, I'd want them to go out and go get a guy who can really make an impact and, might not have the injury questions that a Michael Thomas or Odell has. So the Ravens have a lot of guys they have to re-sign, and their free agency is going to look, depending on what happens with Justin Madubuike here in the franchise tag, a couple different options of how it could look. But Baltimore is going to have to do some rebuilding in that wide receiver room, because the only wide receiver under contract right now on their roster beyond this upcoming year, it's Zay Flowers, and that's it. There's no one else besides Zay Flowers on the roster. So there are going to have to be decisions made, and I'm not saying Odell or Michael Thomas is a long-term solution, but they do have the potential to maybe go sign a guy here or there in free agency, and we'll talk about some of those name options later in the week as we get closer and closer to free agency. Coming up in the final part of the show, though, we'll talk about Justin Madubuike and the franchise tag and what directions the Ravens can go in before the 4 p.m. deadline today. Stay tuned, plenty to talk about on Locked On Ravens. First, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus special lending and $5 bet. It's $150 if your bet wins. The NBA is in full swing right now. We're getting pretty close to the playoffs, and for me, I'm a big Denver Nuggets fan. So Nikola Jokic, those Nuggets, maybe Jamal Murray too. You want to bet on those guys. You can bet all your favorite players and teams on the NBA with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and so much more. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. We're back, our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Ostreicher still here talking with you. Really appreciate everybody for tuning in today and making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day. I really do appreciate it. We started the show back in 2019. I've been hosting it for almost 5 years now, which is incredible to think about. You can subscribe on YouTube. You can subscribe in audio form, both audio and video listeners and watchers. I appreciate everything, even on social media. We've built great communities over there as well. We're building on Instagram. We're trying to get that up. Twitter has been amazing. So thank you for all the support here on Locked On Ravens. 5 days per week, plus bonus content, even in the offseason. I've never taken a show off here. This is episode number 1,197 consecutively for me. So getting to 1,200 on Friday, which is pretty cool. We're also going to go live later today whenever the Justin Madubuike news drops, whether it is he gets franchise tagged or there's an extension reached. Again, not even going to entertain that third option of him not having anything and he just hits unrestricted free agency. Not going to think about that. But we will be going live later today, so be sure to turn notifications on for this channel to know when we post our content and go live. And if you do miss the live but you want to watch it back, you can do that after the fact on YouTube. It'll also be out in audio form after the fact as well. So let's talk about Madubuike a little bit. And I'm going to try to make this so that the people who already know what happened with Madubuike, they can still watch this, because we're going to go over both scenarios and which one I would rather prefer. So again, at the time of this recording, I don't know what happens with Madubuike, but if you're watching this after the decision happens, you will. So the Ravens have a couple of options with Madubuike. They can franchise tag him or they can reach an extension. Those are the two ideal options. Eric DeCosta made it pretty clear at the Combine that one way or another, he's staying in Baltimore this year, whether he does get franchise tagged or extended. The ideal scenario for them is to extend him, but the franchise tag is a way to obviously just keep him with the team. So let's start with the franchise tag first. If the Ravens do franchise tag Madubuike, it means a couple of different things. Franchise tag is a 1-year fully guaranteed deal, and the franchise tag number, just in general, is you take the average of the top 5 players at a certain position. Those salaries, you average them out, and that is the franchise tag number for that year. Now, you also can talk about the salary cap number and what that means. That also has some level of impact. But with the Ravens, the defensive lineman franchise tag number is $22.1 million. So that's, a hefty price. It's a hefty 1-year salary. That's what it is, right? A 1-year fully guaranteed deal. That number all goes on the salary cap. So if that happens, it keeps him in Baltimore, but it also doesn't mean that that's the be-all, end-all. It doesn't mean that you franchise tag Madubuike and that's it, and that's the salary he's going to be playing on. There's no negotiation. There is negotiation after the franchise tag is placed. You have until, I believe it is July. I think it's July 15th or around then to make a deal. So you can still work on an extension. The franchise tag, a lot of teams even just use it to give them more time to work out a long-term extension before the franchise tag, I guess, quote unquote, becomes official. There are opportunities for the Ravens to work on an extension here before the franchise tag deadline here today at 4. But even if the franchise tag is applied, again, it doesn't mean that the only thing that Madubuike is going to be playing on is a franchise tag. They will have other options to work on the extension. And sometimes things like this can get really close, like big extensions, they can get close, but then 1 or 2 particulars can't get ironed out. Again, the tag gives you a lot of options. But here's the thing with the tag, as I talked about, that's going to hit the salary cap. That number, right when it's placed on them, doesn't have to sign it. That number is going to be on the books, on your salary cap, and that will probably impact how the Ravens do work in free agency, whether it's re-signing their other own guys or trying to bring in guys from outside the organization. It's going to mean that Baltimore is going to have to work with that. And we saw this last year. We went through this exact situation with Lamar Jackson, where the Ravens placed that 32.4, I think it was. It was either 32 or 36 million. I try to block that out of my mind. It was so crazy last offseason. But it was around $32 million, I think. They placed that on him. And that was all on the Ravens books up until Lamar signed his extension. So that's why the Ravens weren't maybe as aggressive or active in last year's free agency, because they had that huge salary cap number. And not to mention, they didn't know who their quarterback was going to be. Although I think all along they knew it was going to be Lamar, but you had that number and it was so big that you couldn't really make things work. So they signed Nelson Aguilar, and then they signed Odell and a couple other guys here and there along the edges. But once Lamar signed that extension, it really freed up the rest of that space for him. So the ideal scenario for them is to agree to an extension before free agency starts, whether that is today before the 4 p.m. deadline, or if that's just before the tampering period starts in a week, which is crazy. Literally a week from today, free agency tampering starts, or it's a week from yesterday. Actually, wow, it's March 11th, Monday. So a week from yesterday, it will be free agency time. So if the Ravens do sign Madubuike to an extension before free agency starts, what you can do with that, if it's a 4 or 5 year deal, ideally, I mean, I assume that's what's going to happen. I think Spotrac has him at like 4 years, $83.1 million, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe it's 81.3, one of those two numbers. You can make the first year cap hit, even the first couple of years of that deal, those cap hits, you can put them on the lower side and make it a backloaded deal so the Ravens can maximize these next couple of seasons before that deal obviously inflates and becomes very backloaded. That's what the Ravens have to do at this point. I feel like their roster is too good not to go for it right now. Having Madubuike on the $22.1 million franchise tag, look, he's a guy that you have to keep around regardless of how you do it, franchise tag or not. 13 sacks. Interior pressure is so hard to find. Madubuike is so valuable to what the Ravens do on defense in the interior. And plus, if you let him go, people could argue, oh, well, you can use that money for other positions. You use the money, you'd have to replace Madubuike if he walks. So to me, I think the best option is to keep him around. Eric DeCosta clearly said that was going to be the case at the combine. So I'd be shocked if that does not happen. It's going to happen one way or the other. But the extension gives the Ravens more flexibility to re-sign some of their own guys, to bring in some of their other players. And we've seen some of those contracts. The Ravens use the backloaded strategy. They signed Marcus Williams, that 5-year, $70 million contract. And the first couple of years, I think his cap hit each year was $7 million. Now we're here in year 3, and he has the 4th highest cap hit on the team. So the Ravens like to do business that way. What I'm going to be curious about, though, and this is just kind of getting into a general conversation, but with this contract in particular, are the Ravens going to use void years for some of their players? They started to do it last year with Odell and Lamar and some of those guys. It's going to be interesting to see how the Ravens actually end up going about this whole thing, because void years can free up cap space in the now, but they'll come back and bite you a little bit if it's not done right. And I think the Ravens have the guys around them to do it, right? Eric DeCosta and everybody. So Baltimore could use a couple of void years this offseason to make sure that they can maximize this offseason to the best of their ability. But the first step is to bring back Madubuike. I know there have been a couple of people who have wanted Patrick Queen to get the franchise tag. It's not happening. The franchise tag for Queen actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think it costs more than the defensive line tag. So first of all, that's not great. And second of all, I think Madubuike is just too valuable. And if they're not able to agree to an extension with him, it has to go on Madubuike. That's all I have here today on Locked on Ravens. Thanks so much for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe on YouTube here, also in audio form here, wherever you're listening to this show or watching it. Reminder, we're going live later today, whether that Madubuike extension or franchise tag happens. Whenever it happens, we go on live a couple hours after that, maybe even an hour or so after. So be sure to turn notifications on. And if you're not able to watch live, the live shows are great because we're able to engage in the chat and talk there, which is great, and kind of take the opinions of everybody who's watching. So it's really fun. But if you're not able to watch, it'll be available after the fact, both in video form and audio form. Be sure to, again, subscribe, follow along, like the video, subscribe audio and video form, follow along on Twitter and Instagram at Chaos34. And I'll see you right back here later today on Locked on Ravens.